Thank you. Welcome. My name is Tom Hubbard. I'm the Senior Vice President at NEHI, the Network for Excellence in Health Innovation. We are a nonprofit health policy think tank. Essentially, it's headquartered here in Boston. And if I didn't do so earlier this morning, I want to thank Mass General Brigham for the opportunity to moderate this panel and the panel previously today on the Inflation Reduction Act and biopharmaceuticals. And so in our previous panel, as most of you saw, we discussed the ongoing implementation of the IRA relative to biopharmaceuticals and stressed a few times that our observations from outside of CMS and the Medicare program are still in the category of essentially informed speculation because there's a lot still not known about how the various provisions, particularly relating to the drug price negotiation program, are going to play out. It's a very accelerated time frame for implementation. It is now subject to litigation. As folks may know, there was a major lawsuit launched last week by Merck. There's another one maybe coming this week, and perhaps some more behind it. And with about 10 weeks to go before CMS announces the first list of drugs that it intends to price negotiate over, there is more guidance that is scheduled to come out from CMS regarding this. So a lot left unknown, but certainly major issues have emerged relative to it, and major issues identified by the life science industries. And so in this panel, what we've asked our panelists to do is to talk a little bit about the implications of the Act for innovation in biopharmaceuticals. We're lucky to have two gentlemen here who are directly engaged with drug development and can speak to how the IRA is changing the way they're doing business so far, and what the implications are for drug development and launch over the next few years. And those two gentlemen being Steve Brady to my left, and Dr. John Lepore, also to my left, and Pat Fortune, who some of you know in the room, is with Mass General Brigham in the Innovation Office, and also has a long career in venture capital and in drug development. Will give us a perspective from your several hats, I think. And finally, my thanks to Remy Brim, who has come in from DC this morning for this panel, who we've asked Remy to basically channel everybody else in this conversation, from the patient advocacy world to academic medicine, if you will, something Pat's going to speak to as well. But let me just say, so for the few of you that were not here for our first panel, I will not attempt to give you a disquisition on what's in the Inflation Reduction Act. I'll just sort of restate some highlights that the panel will undoubtedly pick up on. So on the benefit side, there's a considerable amount relating to Medicare Part D prescription drug benefit redesign in the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's all on cutting costs for beneficiaries in various ways. It eliminates, as of January 1st, it eliminated cost sharing for beneficiaries for vaccines that are covered under Medicare Part D, and I would say this if GSK were not on the panel, the sort of poster child for that really is Shingrix, the shingles vaccine. Medicare, the out-of-pocket spending, total out-of-pocket spending for Part D beneficiaries is capped at $2,000. Insulin capped at $35 a month for enrollees that use insulin. Part D premium growth is being capped, so quite a bit over there on the benefit side that we'll have to watch in terms of the impact on, one would think, promoting uptake of medications and promoting, one would hope, patient medication adherence. We will tend to focus over on the manufacturer side in this discussion, obviously, and the implications of what the drug pricing negotiation program in particular may have for innovation in drug development and launch. And just a few highlights there real quickly. Again, manufacturers are going to have to pay rebates if prices exceed the rate of inflation going forward, so that's one thing. The negotiation process, we'll see September 1st, the very first list of 10 drugs. All of them will be in Part D, but the very first list of 10 drugs that Medicare intends to negotiate. Part B drugs, physician-administered drugs, will be introduced or will be subject to the negotiation by 2028, I believe. And 9 general criteria. We talked about this some in the first panel. 9 general criteria that CMS is to use in determining a maximum fair price that it intends to negotiate over with manufacturers. Their R&D costs, the cost of the manufacturer's production and distribution, prior federal support for R&D, data on patent status, general market data, how the drug has been performing in the market, the role it has in the market, evidence about alternative treatments, including evidence as to whether the drug in question represents a therapeutic advance that's meeting an unmet need in particular, evidence around the drugs addressing unmet needs of specific populations like the disabled, and comparative effectiveness data. So the comparative effectiveness of the drug against therapeutic alternatives, or the therapeutic alternatives that are deemed by CMS to really be the comparators. And finally, no orphan drugs are to be included in the negotiation, although there may be impacts on orphan drugs that we can get to. And particularly relevant to this conversation, small molecule drugs are excluded from negotiation for 9 years after launch. Biologics, such as those developed by the biotech industry, are excluded for 13 years past the launch. So with that, I'll turn to our panel here, and I think I call a little bit of an audible from what we previously discussed, and maybe real quick, since Dr. Lepore and Steve, you're both directly engaged in drug development, if you could just start off by just telling us what you're specifically focused on, because it's sort of a different orientation, although some overlapping. And maybe John, if you want to start.
Great.
Speaking for GSK.
Happy to, yeah, and for my own interest as well. First of all, thanks a lot for the invitation. Terrific to be here. I'm an alumnus of several training programs at MTB, so delight to be back here and see some old friends and things as well. So maybe just a little bit background for GSK. I'll keep it extremely short, but the context is important for how we're thinking about the IRA. So we're a global pharmaceutical company. We presently have about 70 drugs in clinical phase development. They're focused predominantly in 4 different areas: infectious disease, HIV, oncology, and respiratory/immunology. And we've got a very bespoke research strategy to drive new drugs entering that portfolio, which is to focus on the science of human genetics, the advancing science of functional genomics to really inform potential novel targets, and then to do this in an agnostic way as to what indications the best science leads to, and in doing so, use whatever modality is best suited to target those particular targets. And we're very pleased with the progress we're making. We now have about 70% of our whole portfolio driven by human genetics, and it's all working out great. However, stepping into this now are these new provisions we're starting to think about for the IRA, which turns several aspects of that strategy I just outlined potentially around and really threw us some curveballs. A couple of them have already been alluded to. Maybe I'll keep it broad and we could come back for details as important. The first one was the focus on small molecules. And I already mentioned that the way we think about it is what's the right modality for a particular target. And frankly, from my vantage point, I can't understand the rationale as to why the biologics were favored as opposed to the small molecules. And one very important reason is that many Medicare-related diseases are for the elderly, in whom the chronic diseases are actually better suited with small molecules. So there's a potential perverse incentive for us to de-emphasize small molecules in favor of monoclonal antibodies and other biologics that are more expensive, harder to deliver, and potentially not even as good for the particular target. So that's one challenge. The other one is, as we think about moving those projects forward, the considerations for what's the right indication sequence and development plan are completely different now. So in terms of indications, it's already been alluded to that, particularly in the prior panel, there's a clock that starts 9 years after first launch of the small molecule and 13 for the monoclonal antibodies. And that's driving us to think about, well, where do you start? Because historically, many of us have thought about starting in something that's very practical, smaller population, maybe even a higher price point, and then build on subsequent indications, including for larger populations and chronic disease. If you do that strategy, then by the time you get to the very high value, high population indication, the price is negotiated down. So that's really driving us to think about, well, let's start with the big indication first. That could work, but one challenge is on the orphan thing you've already alluded to, where, there's an exemption for orphan alone. But if you do orphan followed by common, then it's on the same clock. And there's a potential perverse incentive there, either not to do the orphan or to wait on the orphan until you get the chronic going, which isn't good for patients with orphan indications. And then finally, the thing I'd say also was alluded to in the last panel is development plans are getting more complex. And you went through 9 criteria there of what the Medicare negotiations could look like with CMS, likely to change. And we're having to think about, well, how do we meet all of those 9 criteria in a development plan out of the gate so that we beat the clock? And it's driving a lot more spend up front, consideration of adding real world evidence and other things earlier. And I think one of the challenges, and it'd be interesting to hear your point, Steve, from a small company, is I think it's gonna be really hard for small companies to develop molecules because their thought process sometimes is the opposite. Let's do the least possible and we'll get bought and then someone else will do all the costs, right? And this is flipping it around like, well, wait a minute, we've got to put all the costs in up front. So I think there's going to be a lot of dynamics about how these plans are done, who's doing what, which order of indication. So a lot of things to think about.
Yeah. So Steve, similar concerns, although different disease state you happen to be focused on.
So this is perfect because we're opposite ends of the spectrum. So Tempest is a small Bay Area, California-based oncology company. We have 4 programs ranging from completely novel, and I don't think anyone else is working on the target in oncology, all the way up to some randomized phase 2 data, and we're poised to go into a pivotal phase 3. Interestingly, to GSK, we picked all of our targets based on that we thought they were compelling, that they could move the needle for patients. We ended up with 4 small molecule programs. We did not pick the targets because they were small molecule targets. Obviously, speaking of audibles, none of us saw this coming. I'm also on the board of Bio, and we've been talking about that there was going to come a day where we would be negotiating, and I think that's a really kind word for what it is. We're not negotiating with CMS. But we absolutely, I don't know if you want to jump ahead into the problem, but.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay, so the last panel was really interesting from a policy perspective about the IRA, and there's all this conjecture around, is it going to affect drug development? I'm willing to go on record and say absolutely. Over 50% chance. We're already talking about it. We have a large indication, first-line liver cancer for our lead program, so the orphan piece doesn't come into play for that, but we have 3 other programs. My first meeting at JP Morgan back in January, right out of the gate, 8 a.m. with an investor after the pleasantries was, what are we gonna do about the IRA? And because we're at this stage in the company where we're about to go from randomized data into something, knock on wood, we've been talking to the buy side extensively, the investor community extensively. And there are some who have already pulled out. Some are already saying, I am not going to do small molecule investing. I am going to wait until this thing is fixed. Other people think it's going to be fixed, and therefore they're staying engaged, but it's already happening. We don't have to talk about, are decisions gonna be made? When we do our portfolio analysis, even, small companies, we have to do it too. I would love your budget, by the way. This
Can't
is...
have it.
I know. This is gonna
We
come
can
into
talk
play.
afterwards.
Yeah, no. But this is absolutely gonna come into play. The whole idea, people keep bringing up, are we gonna change from going orphan first? Because again, oncology, we pick targets with potential therapeutic benefit to patients in more than one indication. We never think it's only gonna work at one. Obviously it often does, but the plan is always to try to help multiple patient groups. We're gonna think about that differently now. And one of the gentlemen in the last panel brought up that one of Congress's, the ideas where they picked the 9 and 13 years, which I agree with, I'm fascinated by that. But they said, isn't that when patents normally expire? Shouldn't it be generic competition at that point anyway? So that says, ignore the fact that you may have moved faster and had a longer patent term, we're just gonna drop generic competition in anyway. Everything comes down to, I hate to say this, on the financing side, what is a perceived net present value of your program, right? Whether it's us going out to venture capitalists when we're private, us going out to public investors, we're a public company, or when we're doing deals, right? I mean, part of our ecosystem, we've got the financing community, but we've also got John's side of the equation. I mean, most of us are not just gonna launch into a 28-country global randomized phase 3. We're gonna partner. And now, if the partner hasn't moved off small molecules, these conversations are gonna come into play on economics. So it's already happening. I mean, it's already affecting our decision making. And by the way, I'm one of those optimists. I don't think you can be a biotech drug developer and not be an optimist. I'm an optimist that we're gonna at least remove the small molecule penalty. I don't think we're gonna get out 100% out of price caps, but we do have to fix the time and the way the pricing is done, or the number of companies is gonna shrink and there's gonna be more people without jobs because we weren't gonna be able to fund the programs.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, John.
Not to be controversial.
Just one other thought on the small molecule aspect. This is going to narrow innovation and competition, and I think patient choice, because to be second in class now is going to have to be amazingly differentiated with this very significant amount of evidence, with moving target of what that needs to look like. So I think the companies are going to be disincentivized to try to make a second in class. But putting my physician hat back on, having multiple drugs against a target in a class is very advantageous. We were chatting in the hallway before about this drug might have side effect A, this one might have side effect B. They're probably similar profile from those criteria you have, but from a patient choice, one might be better, and I think that's going to be stifled by this
Great point.
provision.
Well, I think we want to come back to probe the small molecule aspect of this more, but Remy, if I can, and I did call an audible on you in particular here, and your take on, as someone who, among other things, is monitoring and working with patient communities out there, what you're hearing, what are the messages that are breaking through to them, and what are they sending back to CMS and to the policy world?
Yeah, and I guess I would start, I want to do 9 and 13 first, because I want my start at that. So depending on who you talk to, they call it 9 and 13, 7 and 11, right? Starting your negotiation at 7 years or 11 years. I think when it comes to putting our head around the policy piece of it, the original bill would have started negotiation basically at launch. If you launched your drug in sort of year X, your sort of negotiated price could have started at year X plus 2, plan year X plus 2. That bill was negotiated out to say, okay, let's sync it up with FDA's data exclusivity provisions, sort of where it came from, as an attempt to try to be more generous to industry, to not impact launch prices. And so I think when it's it would need to be a statutory fix. CMS does not have authority to sort of change what that looks like. That statutory fix would cost a lot of money, because if you synced them both up with 13, that's going to cost a pretty penny. That's going to be a politically difficult thing to do, to say, let's pay to move it up. If you look at the president's budget, he actually did sync them up. He got rid of the penalty, but he put them both at 5 years of negotiation. So instead of 9 and 13, it was 5. And so I think it's something that we continue to follow, patient groups continue to follow, the entire industry continues to follow, to figure out, okay, when is the right political moment to either spend a lot of money to move them both up to 13? When is time to, we're seeing some things in the investor world, should we sync them both up at 10, right? What is the sort of best sort of policy approach there? In terms of the patient community, I think it's a great question, because for years and years and years, the patient communities have really struggled with affording products. That has been their sort of bread and butter when it comes to advocacy in DC. There's been other issues or disease-specific issues, but primarily that's what they fought for. And so when they see things like the out-of-pocket caps, insulin pricing caps, smoothing, I don't know if we talked about smoothing, but instead of having sort of all of your expenses, if you have really expensive drugs, you could hit your out-of-pocket cap in January or February. That makes those 2 months in the winter, especially after the holidays, for grandparents on a fixed budget, pretty difficult to do. You can now spread your out-of-pocket cap across the whole year. And then you have negotiation hitting in 2026. And so there's some big wins for the patient community in terms of what they've been fighting for. And for the patient community, it's hard to balance these sort of theoretical abandonments or theoretical changes with sort of these real world tangible, okay, X, Y, and Z will be cheaper, right? They're out of pocket. I think we've seen different patient communities start to react not to IRA, but to other changes. I'll bring up the Algehome example. You've seen the Alzheimer's community and other patient communities adjacent. Now that there has been a CMS action and it has actually limited access, they have really kicked up. I mean, you see ads on bus stops, you hear them on podcasts, right? They'll place them, sort of geotag them in DC. I mean, this patient community is furious that they, have essentially almost 2 FDA-approved products, and there's basically no way for folks to get them. The trials aren't set up, the registries aren't set up. And so I think until there's a tangible example, and I hate to say it, but in DC, I think, we're going to need the tangible example of what was that really awesome product in phase 2 that really did work that got abandoned. It's hard for the patients to wrap their mind around a theoretical risk versus a real benefit. And then there's a lot of politics too. They all backed the Democrats, right? Democrats still control the Senate, Democrats still control the White House. And so, elections are going to have consequences too. And I hate to say, this is politics, but, working in DC, how those chambers change, how the presidency change, how the mindsets at CMS change. We think about, 2026 for that first plan year, we might have a different leadership in CMS at that point. And so all of that is going to play into the implementation of those challenges.
Remy, if you would, could you elaborate a little more about where the small molecule versus biologics sort of distinction sort of originated? You mentioned some of the FDA sort of stance on this, but how did that become the dividing line?
Sure. So in FDA world, that's where I sort of spend a lot of my policy time. You get different amounts of data exclusivity for small molecules versus biologics. For a small molecule, you get 5 years. For a biologic, you get 12 years. Right. And so, that is different than a patent, right? It is sort of your data exclusivity, how long, your data cannot be relied upon for a generic or a biosimilar. But that is where those 2 numbers came from, right? They're not exactly synced, but it is that differentiating factor that already exists in federal law that policymakers looked at and said, hey, we're getting a lot of pushback on this, negotiating at launch. We've heard that that's maybe a bridge too far. What can we look to that already exists sort of in this space? And that's how they identified sort of that differential between a small molecule and a biologic.
And how much has this also, if you're a member of Congress or congressional staff, that sort of got ingrained in you because of the whole debate over biosimilars back in the day, that they needed extra protection?
I mean, there's whenever we sort of look at drug bills moving or FDA bills moving, there's always folks that squawk to say, 12 years is too long, right? We should say, or 5 years is too short, or should we sync everything at 7 or 8? That's been an ongoing policy debate. The biosimilars, the 12 years was a negotiation too. So, whether or not it's appropriate to use that differential, I mean, hearing the conversations here today, and it's the same conversations that's happening in DC among the groups, is was that appropriate? What is an appropriate differential to sort of pick out? Does it make sense in this case, or does it make sense to sync them up? And I think the challenge for industry is if we sync them up, they're likely not going to be synced at the current, 13. They're going to be synced up, but slightly lower. And are we okay with that, right? Because based on the investor mix, based on making sure that we're doing the best for patients, is it okay to say, okay, let's do both at 10? And so that's going to be I think the next question as the bio board meets and other folks meet is, what does that look like?
So as a layperson coming at, because I still consider myself a layperson on this, what I've sort of taken away, understanding the kind of development, Steve, for example, that you're doing at Tempest, is that these aren't your grandfather's small molecules anymore, right? These are, this is not, old-fashioned medicinal chemistry or
well, I mean, there's still medicinal chemistry. No, but I mean,
Yeah.
it's too hard to get up and do the same thing, that was done before. So I did fail to say at the beginning, our two lead programs are both precision oncology and do have an immune-mediated aspect to them. So for the geek side of my personality, it's cool. It's really cool science. From the patient side, significant opportunity to move the needle because we're hitting the cells directly, but then we're also enabling the immune system to do its job, which, as you know, in most of us is eradicating malignant cells all the time. I'm not sure that changes this conversation because your point is really well taken about where the 9 versus the 13 came from. That goes to the issue of it requires actual time and thoughtfulness, right, to craft this law well. Again, we always knew, well, we always hoped real price negotiation was going to come and not just, this is the cap. But we knew it was coming. It was naive to think otherwise. The problem was the law is drafted in a way that it's as if no one really understood our entire ecosystem. And we know that's not the case. They just don't care because this polls well, to your point, right? Your points are so well taken around the emotional aspect of what I'm seeing, but how are you going to show me that drug you decided not to do, you can't prove a negative, right? So we absolutely understand, what we're up against in terms of fixing it. And again, I have to have hope, right, that we're fixing it because we were just talking in the hallway about I started out in myeloma, 15 years ago, and what myeloma is now versus what it was when I started. We had a drug approved called carfilzomib, proteasome inhibitor. I don't know if it would have been, developed, right, at this point, and it's dramatic in what it's done for patients. So, I'm hoping that there's some reasonable mix and I'm not going to give up on, what my politics are, but I'll just say I feel like I've been betrayed. I'm hoping that there's some mix in the House and the Senate where we can fix this over time. And I think you're right, Remy. I mean, it's not going to be at 13. But I just want to drive John's point home. The penalty on small molecules, the reason I roll my eyes and I'm flabbergasted by it, even though I agree with you, these are the drugs that if you want to talk about a social contract, right, after we get a return on investment on the program, which, by the way, doesn't just return for that program, it funds the 85% that fail, right, moving forward as well. Our rate, if there's somebody from Tufts here, our rate of IND to NDA or BLA is only improved a few percent, right, in the last 20 plus years, right? So we have to fund those other programs. Small molecules are that social contract. There's an opportunity, I should say, for them to become incredibly affordable and can be taken at home. So you have a completely different healthcare cost. Yeah. And yet that's the entire class of drugs we're now being shifted away from.
Can I just make one point we should come to Pat too, is that I think it's sort of almost naive to think about small molecule and biologic as these two distinct entities. There's such a huge overlap in the modalities. I'm thinking about PROTACs that recruit biological systems and oligos that work in various different ways and fractions of antibodies, mini-bodies and things that really are small molecules. And all these things are overlapping. And I think to just have a distinction that's small and large is pretty naive.
Is not sort of scientifically supported, basically. Well, Pat, I described you as wearing multiple hats in this conversation, including the MGB hat of window into the research, within the MGB system, but also a window into the commercialization of technologies that are developed at MGB. And maybe I should ask you the question that I asked John and Steve, which is, how is all this changing the way, and I realize you're speaking for yourself here. I say as I look over at the MGB team, you're speaking for yourself here. How is this changing your perspective? I'll put it that way.
Well, I think it's between, it starts with where Stephen and John are, and then go to the left, go earlier, because our role is really to first make a choice as to what intellectual property can be derivable from basic science and have a chance at becoming a drug or becoming a therapeutic. Then worry about how do you take it forward in the form of translation, take it from the bench into a first-in-human study. All of those require a different set of decisions. From a modality point of view, actually, if you're an academic medical center, because of the need for medicinal chemistry and the implications of a requirement for large screening libraries in order to make that work well, we like the large molecule side. And actually, we like the genetic side. One of the things on ultra-rare diseases that's very interesting is that variants of genes that are manifested as ultra-rare disorders in a different variant could be manifested in a large disorder in a later patient population. So in an infant, a cardiovascular disorder can involve the same gene you will focus on for an aortic aneurysm about 75 years later. And that now crosses the dimension of everything that we talked about here. So these are the things we really, the space over which we have to begin to make these decisions. And one of the things that hasn't been talked about so much in the discussion, either in the prior panel or this one, is what we have to worry about. Actually, we worry about both of these guys, is how are they going to think about the value of intellectual property at an early stage, and in essence, how much are they going to be willing to pay for it? So we have to come in front of much earlier in their course of making that decision, and begin to think through those things as we begin to think about what it is we are going to commercialize. Now, if you look at the Affordable Care Act, a lot of emphasis has gone into the negotiation side. It was an interesting study that was, as part of the summary of the Affordable Care Act, the Congressional Budget Office put together an estimate of what it's going to mean in terms of the number of drugs that will not get developed. So it's these are all very crude estimates by definition. And what they said was, out of the 1,300 drugs, new drugs you would expect to see between 2023 and 2052, only 13 will be foregone. Now, that number makes no sense as far as I can tell. But if you look at the way economists think about it, they go through a series of models which really asks the question that affects us, that people like John and GSK think about when they make portfolio decisions, and what is the elasticity for R&D with respect to future expected revenue. If you take that model, and there are a number of academic models that have been developed to do that, the number you get is not 13 drugs, but about 300 drugs that will be missed. They then go on to do some very interesting calculations that suggest the number of quality-adjusted life years that will be lost as a result of that is twice as much as were lost as a result of COVID. So the point of all this is there are many different things in the Act that people like like GSK are going to go through to readjust the way that they're going to think about how they're going to make R&D investments, how many drugs they really can, what classes of drugs, what therapeutic areas, and what modalities, and those are the things we think about. One final comment I'd make on that, when you look at the number of drugs that are going to be reduced based on the academic models, it isn't the price negotiation that drives it. It's the inflation effect. The idea that you will pay a penalty by the amount, if you exceed price increases as a result of prices exceeding inflation, that penalty is more than twice as big as a negotiation penalty when you ask about the number of drugs that are going to be developed. So that's the kind of thing we think about. Mm-hmm. We actually are happy whether it's a small molecule or a large molecule, because one of the things, as John said, the technology that's developed, whether it's then you don't really need to do X-ray crystallography anymore. You can do cryo-EM. Allows you to do things with small molecules in a more effective and efficient way that you used to have to think about large molecules or antibodies to do. So we're happy to do either of them. What we don't know is, what is the market really going to want? Mm-hmm. What are they going to be willing to pay for that'll justify us taking those things forward?
And Pat, the modeling so far, does it indicate that any particular field like oncology versus something else would be particularly affected, or?
No, what it does is it doesn't look at it from a therapeutic point of view, but what it looks at it as, what are the diseases that tend to, actually Remy brought up an interesting one, when you think about Alzheimer's disease, what are the ones that are automatically going to fall into a Medicare population?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so, for example, we talked about this a little bit, Eliquis, which is an antiarrhythmic for non-valvular diseases, that's a pure Medicare drug. Mm-hmm. That's a $12 billion drug, which I can pretty much would bet is going to be one on the top of the list coming this September. Those are the drugs that people are going to begin to think twice about making as to where they're going to fall in a reimbursement category, not when they're going to get to falling in a reimbursement category. That the interesting thing about Alzheimer's is Alzheimer's with drugs like Leqembi are moving from a Medicare drug to a pre-Medicare drug.
Yeah.
Because it's going to be intervene early, intervene this way, and it may take you 13 years to get to Medicare. That one, paradoxically, you'd think about, well, that's an old person's, speaking as an old person, disease. That would fall in front of this negotiation act, and it won't. That's how the economists think about it.
Yeah.
So they break it about where in the reimbursement category you're going to fall. And what they don't answer is a question that came up in the earlier panel, which nobody seems to know, is how are these things going to bleed from Medicare to private pay?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And that's a prediction nobody I've seen that has done a very good job with.
But I will say on that modeling point, though, at least from a business perspective, as soon as that price is published, everyone's just going to model that that's the price across the board. Right. Even though it may take a little while.
Right.
Mm-hmm. John, yeah.
Yeah, Pat, I'm thinking if I were in academic medical centers' shoes, what I think about it. And you guys hold the trump card, though, which is what's the new biology that really opens up the opportunity to think about intervening in disease in a very new way.
Right.
And all of this is going to change. You raised this in the last panel, Tom. And 5 years from now, it could be IRA, IRB, or something, right? But what's always going to be the trump card is new biology that profoundly affects disease. So that's what I try to steer my teams towards. Like, you can't be a marginal effect. Like, this has to be a new pathway, like really significant value proposition that you could articulate now in the science phase.
Yeah.
In many respects, things like generics we don't even think about. That's so far down the road from where we go. But everything we pick up is starting with new biology. That's right.
Yeah, but John, the coolest biology, though, is still going to run into exactly the same issues, right? I mean, you may find something compelling, but if we're going to...
No, hold on. Yeah, but not new biology, cool cell paper. New biology.
No, my world is drugs.
Yeah, but
so
this is like
cool
I live
biology
this
that
every
leads
day.
to drugs.
No, it's new biology that has a profound effect on disease. Because in the end, that's what's going to drive the differentiation and the price negotiation. And today it's called biology. Then it's going to be, evidence. but you have to have a way to get to the evidence.
Uh-huh.
Agreed.
John, feel free to beg off this question, but something that's very much in the on the policy screen in DC is infectious respiratory disease. So, to what extent can you comment on how this changes, the way you approach novel, and a sudden need for?
This is a whole 2-hour panel.
Yeah.
Let me just say that prior to COVID, across the industry, the conversation was infectious disease is tough. There's no payer model that can support this.
Yeah.
I think COVID taught us all that infectious diseases are important, and there's a clear value driver given you mentioned the total quality is lost, and et cetera. So I think that all got turned on its head. But how that plays out over time, again, small molecules, vaccine, antibodies, it still comes down to where is there a really strong story for differentiation in a way that helps the patients markedly, like dramatically. We'll figure that out.
Well, I think a good example of that is what you've seen actually happen in CAR T, and it actually plays into a conversation you had as part of the first panel. When you think about lymphomas and leukemias that were, you started off with patient response rates that were tiny when you got the fourth line therapies, third and fourth line therapies, that all of a sudden you began to see overall responses in the 50-60% rate, which is a phenomenal kind of thing. And then what you saw was it begin to back down to third line, to second line, ultimately first line. And when you think about CAR T in first line, to John's point, that's a cure. Now, a cure meaning something that's going to last 10 years. You can't say it's a cure until you've watched it for 50 years. But those kinds of differences between, you mentioned the multiple myeloma in the same way. CAR T for multiple myeloma is quite a bit different than small molecules for multiple myeloma, and ultimately that modality is just going to dominate.
I think the CAR T piece raises a good example where you had sort of the idea of the groovy new technology, huge gains in life, it's a paradigm shift. And I think that would not necessarily have happened had CMS gotten their way when CAR T first came out. So CMS first came out when CAR T came out. They said, okay, that's great, this is lovely. We're going to do coverage with evidence development, which is exactly the same thing that they've done in the Alzheimer's space. And the patient community and the oncology community really revolted against that. And eventually won, right? CMS is covering CAR T. There was sort of issues with reimbursement, and that's another 2-hour panel on the history of CAR T. But I think it shows that we're thinking about IRA, we're thinking about sort of these new provisions. CMS has a lot of authority, and they've been, they can do a lot when they do a national coverage determination on when these products come to market. They are proposing demos through the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation to pay for accelerated approval products less than other products upon launch. They are looking at potentially trying to sort of assist in the negotiation of gene therapy between manufacturers and states upon launch. In theory, it's going to be voluntary, but what does that look like and what levers do they use? So I think it's important on the ecosystem front too to remember things like CAR T and all of those sort of misses. I think CMS, at least under this administration, is being extremely aggressive on sort of all of the tools in their toolbox they can use, which I think makes the ecosystem even more uncertain when we don't know what they're going to pull out.
Remy, while we're at it, you care to make a prediction on coverage with evidence development and where CMS might go with that?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, I guess for Alzheimer's, they already have the national coverage determination, and they have it for accelerated approval products and fully approved products. That came out when they did the original. Press is not reading the original NCD when they pick up that CMS is doing different things. They're doing exactly what they said in the NCD. They are not backing down. They put out a press release in the last week basically saying, we're going to do this, isn't this great? We're only going to require a registry and not a trial. I mean, that's them really doubling down on their decision. This would be the first, with the Alzheimer's products, it's the first time that CMS has used coverage with evidence development for an FDA-approved indication of a drug. Coverage with evidence development has historically been off-label uses of drugs, new uses for devices, and so I think, they've continued to push back on the Alzheimer's community. They've pushed back on Congress and said, we're going to do this. And I think that they're going to try to use it more, especially when we think about products like you mentioned that are these primarily Medicare populations. How do they have leverage out of the gate? They have leverage out of the gate by saying coverage with evidence development. which goes to a conversation about should there be more coordination between FDA and CMS when you're designing a post-market trial, or, you know, those conversations have been going on for a long time, but I think that, you know, these types of coverage and reimbursement levers are going to accelerate that conversation, especially when we think about, you know, where does FDA place small molecules versus biologics? I agree, it's getting sort of murky between the two. FDA sort of has their lines, but there's bills in Congress telling FDA to put things, starting to put things in different buckets, right? Because they're complicated. These aren't just sort of easy pill press molecules anymore. And so I think the conversation is going to, you know, go through not just the legislation, but, you know, what happens on the FDA side, what happens on the sort of CMS authority side, and potentially Congress intervening and putting some more guardrails on those if they continue to make these decisions that really anger the patient community.
I know we're coming close to our time limit. Unfortunately, I want to look out at the audience and see if anybody has a question they would like to ask our panel. If not, I'll double time check. John, what I hear you saying is it's sort of instructing your team to think in terms of how the scientific opportunities ought to just reshape the whole thinking about this. And, you know, the question I would pose to Remy, maybe as a Capitol Hill savvy person, is can a reframing of all this based on the sort of the scientific realities, you know, maybe that the small molecule versus biologics distinction is no longer a useful distinction. How soon are they going to be receptive to that kind of reframing? Because you also pointed out the reasons why the law has got to be implemented the way it's going to be implemented.
Right.
Steve's mentioned this too, at least, you know, for some period of the initial period of years.
I think it's going to take some time, honestly. I mean, we saw similar things with the Affordable Care Act, right? I mean, the Affordable Care Act was sort of this untouchable entity until it wasn't, until, you know, we basically got rid of all the pay-fors for the Affordable Care Act over time, you know, unwinding all of those where we know all the different industries paid, and I think pharmas was the only one that unfortunately did not get unwound with the Affordable Care Act. But, you know, tweaks to how that, you know, how things were drafted, they had to use the reconciliation process for that too. So when you use a reconciliation vehicle, it's sort of a special way to pass a law with only one party. There's a lot of limitations on how you can draft a bill. And so the Affordable Care Act, part of it was in reconciliation, so that caused some drafting issues. The same thing with the Inflation Reduction Act. You know, they had to keep it in sort of, you know, certain narrow ways of drafting, which limited their ability to sort of get things maybe perfect or go into the amount of detail they otherwise would have in a standard bill. And so I think that there's an opportunity there. I think it's just going to take time. I think it will be a, you know, what happens after we fully roll out, you know, all the Part D redesign pieces, all the smoothing and the out-of-pocket caps, and, you know, what does that do? What do the savings look like? You know, do we see better medication adherence? Do we see better outcomes? You know, what's this initial list? The initial list of drugs, as you mentioned, comes out in September. That will start plan year 2026, right? So, you know, thinking sort of 2 years past an election. What does that list look like, and what is the impact right away? What is the price they come up with? How does the process go? You know, what factors really went into that first benchmark? Did this say, okay, it's 75% cheaper, or is there, you know, do they produce a more thoughtful document that really weighs all that evidence? And I think all of those different factors are really going to play into what is the appetite, sort of make that change out of the gate.
So as we're coming to a close here, I'll keep you, you know, with one last question, and I think it's the question that I asked Steve Pearson and Peter Newman initially. So there's about 10 weeks to go before this first list comes out. I know Tempest won't have anything on that list, but the GSK might. What are all four of you sort of most anxious to learn in the next 10 weeks, given that we just still don't know the full contours of the implementation of the program? And there'll still be a lot of questions on September 1st, clearly, but are there any things in particular that jump out that you're anxious to see in CMS guidance, or just for a better sense as to how CMS intends to move forward?
Well, that's it, right? And so in the last panel, they talked about the nebulousness of how the price cap imposition is actually going to happen. And I think there's anxiety around what the precedent is going to be. Right?
I'm interested to see actually that when they put out guidance for plan year 2027, this guidance was very specifically for plan year 2026. So some of the questions about bill drafting and what, where CMS had wiggle room, do they pick the same, do they sort of lock in their procedures for 2027? Or does some of their interpretation change where different folks think they have wiggle room? Also looking at the pushback, right now they're trying to implement it with gross price, not net price, in terms of those sales. There's a lot of legal questions about how they've tweaked some definitions and rulemaking about 6 months ago, whether that stands or whether they're going to need to start taking into account sort of net price after rebates, which is going to be a much bigger deal in the Part B space, obviously, than Part B. But that's what some of the stuff we're watching.
Pat, any?
I think it's similar to what was said on the previous panel. I think once you start a negotiation with a maximum price, it's kind of hard to think what a negotiation looks like when you know what that number is, and it's already drastically cut. But how that's going to play out and the logic that'll be used and the comparators that'll be used in order to progress that negotiation, it'll be interesting to see.
Great. And John, last word?
Yeah, I'd say more clarity on the 9 criteria that are going to be used for the negotiation. Some of them make some sense, but they're very broad and they're not specific. And the problem we could run into is we have to have the development plans in place during this period. And the more time we're doing that with uncertainty, the less opportunity we have to have really the criteria that are going to be required. And maybe I'll just say the last thing, slightly more optimistic than maybe some of might be reflecting on my comments. There's by far not been a better time to be in drug development because of where the science is providing opportunity. And it's kind of like, nature will find a way. The good science is going to make its way into drugs. It's just got a little bit trickier in the last period here with this. And I think we'll come to some reason, and I'm still very optimistic about what we can do.